So I didn't see him. I mean, I saw him, but I didn't see him as someone who could help me decide about bushes, whether I should go with lilacs or roses. I was at Soil Service on Troost. It's been there 90 years. It's a diverse area. It's a diverse staff. But for some reason, I didn't see this young man as someone who could help me. I mean, to be fair, I tend to gravitate towards people for guidance who are as old as me or older, look like me, people I'm familiar with. But the truth is, I have this category in my brain, people who know about bushes and people who don't. And this young Black man fit in the category of people who don't know about bushes. I'm embarrassed to say that. I know better. I spend a lot of time, day in and day out, week in and week out, working on issues like this. It reminded me of another time in my life when I'd been a part of separating people. It was 2010. I was in the West Bank in the Palestinian territories. I was with a delegation and we were visiting a place called the Alternative Information Center. And it was an agency of Palestinians and Israelis that were committed to some kind of peaceful solution. And we had arrived somehow at the wrong day, the wrong time. This was one of those typical, not-for-profits, people and boxes smushed together everywhere. There were posters about rallies and notes on the wall reminding the staff to wash their dishes, that kind of a thing. And someone got pulled off of another project. They crammed us together in this little cubicle. A woman named Deborah. I'm guessing she was maybe 45 at the time. She was from Chicago. She was an American. She was a Jew, and she had gone to Israel to claim her citizenship. And when she got there and she saw the occupation and the reality of the settlement, she had become involved in this effort to bring peace. And so she talked to us for a while and she gave us an overview. You could tell she was maybe a little annoyed by all the Americans who come through and have the solutions and the answers and don't know why things haven't been settled yet. And then when she was done, she kind of passed the baton to a young man named Shadir. He was tall and thin and dark and Palestinian and quiet, and English was more like his third or fourth language. And after he spoke, he asked if we had questions, and someone in the group asked if Deborah, who had gone off to another part of the office, could come back to answer some questions. He looked a little offended, maybe hurt, but really kind of resigned, like people do this to him all the time. So he had walked off and we could see Deborah and Shadir kind of across the way talking to each other, glancing at our group. And then after a while, they came back together and Deborah said, I understand your request. We get this a lot. But in this office, our work is joint work, Palestinian and Israeli. We speak with one voice. We refuse to be separated. Separation is always a tool of the oppressor. It's always a tool of colonialism and dictatorship. And we refuse separation. I mean, we understood and we got it. And for the next hour or so, we continued to direct most of our questions to Deborah, because she was like us. She was American and she was strong and she was powerful and she knew. And you could just see Shadir, who was so used to being discounted and discarded, kind of shrinking a bit. That's where separation happens. Pentecost begins in that place. The very first lesson from the book of Ezekiel is this passage that names the reality that we are cut off from our own bodies, right? It's a valley of dry bones. It could be Gettysburg. It could be, children being carried from the rubble of a building in Gaza or Aleppo, name your place. It's this sense that we are lifeless and gone, that our skin and our sinew, that we are cut off from our core. And many of us have felt that even this last year. And then the passage in Acts is even more bleak. Forget about the day when God's Spirit moved on the face of the water and created this beautiful planet. No, in this passage, the whole earth has been cut off and separated from God. The whole earth is crying out for deliverance. I mean, you can see the coral underneath the ocean floor choking underneath the islands of plastic. And then we come to the passage in John today, the 15th chapter. Jesus has ascended. He's telling the disciples he's going to leave. It's this farewell discourse. They're panicked. What's going to happen? But he promises them what? I'm going to bring the paraclete for you. That's the Greek word. It means the comforter. It means the encourager. It means the advocate. It means that no matter what you're facing, it might be the end of a relationship. It might be a huge transition. It might be a pink slip at work. It means that God is going to be with you, right there with you. And then the passage today from Acts. I mean, it is, again, the Super Bowl of God's Spirit, right? There are all these people from so many different places. They cannot possibly get along or understand one another. They speak so many languages. They're from so many layers of so many places. And then what happens? Whoosh! I mean, just like that. People, their eyes are open and they look around and they see God. They see the Spirit dancing among them. They feel the rush of the wind. They understand that God is somehow in them, and they feel this Spirit and this connection. And all of a sudden, they are brought alive again. That's Pentecost. If Christmas is about what? God with us, then Pentecost is us with God. It's this whole season when all of us are invited to ask, where do you come alive? And what is God calling you to do? And like really going forward, how are you going to step up and add even more to the world? That's the whole day and the whole season and the whole calling. Rita McMahon grew up in rural Connecticut, and she loved animals. When she was a little girl, she would go across the street, help the veterinarian take care of all the injured animals overnight. And then when she moved to New York City, she completely lost that. And then one day in 1995, she was driving along and she saw this Canadian goose that was injured, wasn't moving. She got out, she stopped her car, she put her raincoat on it, she took it home, she put it in her bathtub, and she spent the next 3 days on the phone trying to find some place in New York City that could treat this Canadian goose. And there was no place, the largest city in the United States, without some kind of rehab. So she started it. She found someone else who was into wildlife rehab, and she started bringing birds to her apartment. Swallows and sparrows and owls and hawks and pigeons, of course. And at one point she had 60 birds in her apartment. And then she finally started this wild bird fund with this other guy. And that was in 2013 when they finally got their own facility on Columbus Avenue. Since then, they have rescued 36,000 birds. That's a lot of birds. There's a lot of birds in New York City, like 350 species pass through there, north and south. It's on one of the migratory waterways, all kinds of birds, the common and the most wild and rare. And what happens day in and day out, 20 times a day at least, is someone like a woman in a white Chanel suit who works on Madison Avenue, who sees a pigeon go under a car, and next thing you know, she's underneath that car too, carrying that pigeon in, covered in black suit. And Rita hears it over and over. People say, I've never touched a wild animal in my life. I've never done anything like this in my life, but I looked at this bird and it looked at me, and I knew it wanted my help. And she says, to be honest, pigeons are like that. Pigeons make eye contact, and that works out well for them because people like that. But it's not just good for the pigeon. It's good for New York City. It's good for the 36,000 people. Over and over, Rita has seen it happen. Someone comes in there carrying a bird that never done this ever, but somehow they bring this bird in there, and next thing you know, they're volunteering, right? Next thing you know, they're thinking about the environment and the cats and the cars and the buildings and the lead and the tar and how they can make New York City a different place. Next thing you know, something is coming to life in them. It wasn't a baby this time. It wasn't a bird. It was a baby. It was in August of 2000. And Danny Stewart was on his way to see his boyfriend, Pete, of 3 years, for dinner. And he was running late. He was rushing through the subway. It was late. There weren't as many people in there. And he saw this baby doll laying near the turnstile. And he glanced, some kid must have dropped their baby. And then he realized the legs were moving. And so he unwrapped this baby and realized the umbilical cord, the baby was naked. The baby was like 3 hours old. and he was looking for someone to help him. This was in the day before cell phones. He couldn't find anyone else around, so he kind of covered the baby up. He knew there was a payphone above the 15th Street subway. He ran up there, he made a call, he called 911. He said, "There's a baby, I found a baby, hurry, please, please." He ran back down, he was with the baby, he was touching the baby and stroking the baby, its big brown eyes looking up at the little boy and telling him it's gonna be okay. I thought, this is taking forever. So he ran back upstairs, he had one more quarter, he somehow reached his partner, Pete, and explained to him what had happened. And Pete said, "I'm on my way." Pete and the police arrived about the same time. They were holding the baby, caring for the baby. Then they took the baby to St. Vincent Hospital, and the police continued to question Danny for like a couple more hours, telling him the story, asking him again, exactly, did you see anybody? Did you see anything? Finally, the police left, and Danny and Pete went to dinner. They spent the whole dinner talking about this baby. And Pete said, "You'll be connected to that baby for the rest of your life." I thought maybe they could find out later what happened. And every year they'd send the baby a little birthday card. They assumed that the baby had been placed with the family. Danny himself was a social worker. They had reached out to the pediatric social worker and said, "We can't tell you anything." 3 months later, though, we got a call. They said, "No mother has been found. We need to terminate the rights, and it'll be quicker if you can come and testify at a hearing." So Danny shows up at the Manhattan Family Court. There's the judge, there's the social workers, there's the police, there's the court reporter, and they ask him to tell a story. He tells a story again. He'd been on the news by this point. He'd become a hero in New York City. He explains the whole thing. And then the judge says to him, after he testifies, "Can you wait until the end of the hearing?" So then the police speak, and then the judge looks at Danny, and she says to the whole courtroom, "I just want to be sure everybody understands what's going to happen next. In these situations, we really like to place the child in pre-adoptive custody so that it can be pre-adoptive foster care, so it can be adopted as quickly as possible." And she looked at Danny and she said, "Would you be interested in adopting this baby?" And he said, like everyone in the court looked right at him. And all he could think was, and he said, "Yes, but I don't think it's that easy." And she said, "If you're interested, it can be that easy." So when it was over, he went home, he called Pete. Pete was like, "Are you kidding me? Are you even serious? We live in an apartment with another guy. We got no money. We got all this debt. We don't know anything at all about it. How could you have said this?" And Pete said, "Look, there's going to be a visitation hearing. Just promise me you'll go with me." "I'm going, but I'm not going to do anything. I'm not making any promises." Well, you know what happened. You know, that social worker, she put that baby in Pete's hands. And he looked up at him with those big brown eyes, and he literally wrapped his finger around their heart. And I mean, the next day they were told by the social worker, it'll take 6 to 9 months. There's going to have to be home studies, and there's going to have to be background checks, and there'll have to be, you know, they went through the long thing. The first step is you go to this hearing tomorrow to let the judge know you intend to adopt the baby. They go to the hearing on Wednesday. It's the same judge. It's December 20th. She looks at them, she asks them their intention, and then she says to them, "How would you like to take the baby home for a Christmas visit?" And they're like, okay. And so 2 days later, that baby came home with them. And you know what happened, of course? It was the storybook ending. I mean, Pete was a graphic designer. They wanted Kevin, as they called him, to know how he'd been found, not to hear it from someone else. So they made their own little book about it. And every day, little Kevin would read that book at age 4 and 5. They had the subways come to life, Andy and Clara. It told about how he was discovered. They didn't even tell him. They had the same names, Danny and Pete and Kevin. And when he was 6, he finally said, "Is this my story?" And they said, "Yes." And he took that little book to school and he told everybody, and the teachers thought it was the greatest thing in the world. You can see that book now. They actually finally published it. You can follow their family, see them as they grew up. Danny is now older, and Pete too, and Kevin is now 21. He's a college student studying math and science. He runs marathons. He plays ultimate frisbee. You can see their family kayaking and playing ball. You can see them touring all the national parks. And whenever they tell this story, what do they say? They say, "There was that day when we found each other in the subway. Remember that time when we found each other?" Because, of course, it wasn't just that they found the baby, right? But the baby found them. And their whole life has been different, has been changed, has been transformed. This faith that brought them this incredible gift. We spend our whole life separating people. People who know bushes, people who don't know bushes, right? People who have the answer and people who we need to give the answer to. And yet there is inside us all this stirring of God, this part that calls us out, this part that calls us to reach deep and risk and to live in a fresh new way. May this Pentecost season invite us to look at the babies and the bushes and the birds in fresh new ways, that we might truly live as God's resurrected people. Amen.
Amen.